At my grandma's funeral, my dad smirked. She always said you were the disappointment of the family. I just smiled, walked up to the podium, and read the last line of the will. To my favorite grandson, I leave the house, the jewelry, and the $200,000 life insurance payout. The rest can fight over the leftovers. Then I just walked out. Now they're desperately trying to talk to me, saying, "Don't forget that we're family, please." It was at my grandmother's funeral of all places that my father decided to remind me of my place. As I walked past him, he leaned in just so that only I could hear. She always said, "You were the family disappointment." I didn't break stride, but I felt the words hit me sharp and familiar, like a slap that had long since stopped hurting. I reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and scanned the room. My mother, her head tilted at a tragic angle, dabbing at the corners of her eyes with a lace handkerchief. My sisters, whispering to each other in low, anxious tones, their perfectly painted faces twisted in anticipation. I unfolded the piece of paper in my hand, my thumb brushing the corner of my grandmother's last words. She had written them herself, her handwriting still sharp and elegant even in the last days of her life. When her hands trembled and every breath was a struggle, I cleared my throat, letting the silence linger a bit too long. To my beloved grandson, I began, my voice cutting through the heavy air. I'm leaving the house, my jewelry, and $200,000 in life insurance. You can fight for the rest. There was a moment, just a flicker, when the room felt as if it had stopped breathing. Then the whispers began. A low, rising tide of shock and confusion. I saw my father's grin turn into a tight line, my mother's eyes widen, and my sisters exchanged frantic, panicked glances. I didn't bother to meet their gaze as I stepped down from the podium, my footsteps echoing off the polished wooden floor. I made my way back down the aisle, each step taking me further away from the life I had always felt trapped in. I could almost hear my grandmother's dry, knowing chuckle echoing in my head. She had seen them for what they were long before I had. As I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the church, the brisk fall air hit my face, cutting through the lingering scent of incense and wilting leaves. My phone buzzed before I reached the car. I glanced at the screen, the messages popping up one after the other. "Ryan, we need to talk. Please don't make any rash decisions. Don't forget we're a family. Please." I dropped my phone into my pocket without bothering to reply, pulling my coat tighter against the chill. Family. Funny how they remember that word when it suits them. I reached my car, the old rusting Subaru my grandmother had helped me buy when I first moved out. It had been her way of encouraging my independence, a quiet nudge to escape the suffocating grip of my parents' control. I slid into the driver's seat, the leather creaking under my weight, and let out a slow breath as I turned the key. As I pulled away from the church, I caught a glimpse of my father stepping out onto the steps, his phone clutched tightly in his hand, his face contorted in a mixture of shock and anger. I smiled and stepped on the gas a little harder. They had spent years treating me like the family embarrassment, the one who never quite lived up to their expectations. They had gone on lavish vacations without inviting me, openly mocked my career choices, and made me feel like an outsider in my own home. But now I had something they wanted. And for the first time in my life, I had the power to make them beg. For the first few days after the funeral, I let the calls go straight to voicemail. I needed the silence, the time to just sit in my grandmother's house and let the reality of her absence sink in. The house still felt like her. The soft scent of flowers in the air, the soft ticking of the old grandfather clock in the foyer, and the stacks of gardening magazines she never quite got around to throwing away. I spent my days going through her things, carefully folding her sweaters, dusting the framed photos of her from decades past, and watering the plants she had so carefully tended. It felt like a small way to keep her close, a way to hold on to the warmth she had always shown me, even when the rest of the family had grown cold. Then the messages began to pile up. First, they were polite, almost cautious. "Hey Ryan, we should talk soon. Family meeting? Dad? Honey, let's have dinner. We need to discuss the arrangements. Mom? Hey Ryan, let's talk. We miss you. Emily, don't be a stranger, little brother." We need to stick together. Sarah, I ignored each of them. I had no interest in their sudden change of heart. They had treated me like an outsider for years, and I wasn't going to let them pull me back into their orbit just because I had something they wanted. Then late one night, as I was sorting through a box of old photo albums, there was a sharp knock on the front door. I put the box down and peered through the lace curtains. My father's car was parked in the driveway, its headlights cutting through the fog that had crept in with the evening chill. I opened the door just enough to see his eyes. He looked older, the lines in his face deeper, the confidence that had always defined him fading. For a brief second, he seemed almost nervous. "Ryan," he said, forcing a tight smile, "you've been ignoring our calls." I leaned against the door frame and crossed my arms. "I've been busy." He glanced past me, his eyes sweeping over the familiar entryway, the polished wood floors, the faint glow of the antique lamp in the hallway. "Can I come in?" I let the silence stretch, the cool air seeping in through the crack in the door. "No." His jaw tightened, a glimmer of the man I grew up with flashing in his eyes. "Ryan, we're family. We should talk about this." I couldn't help the bitter smile that tugged at my lips. "Funny. You never cared about family when you and Mom were in the Maldives celebrating her last days." He winced, the color draining from his face. For a moment, he looked almost small, his shoulders slumping as the weight of his actions settled around him. But the look faded quickly, replaced by a hard, calculating stare. "Ryan, we have to figure this out. This house, their savings. We should handle this together." I felt a sharp, satisfying anger flare in my chest. "Work this out? You mean figure out how to take what she left me? No thanks." Before he could respond, I slammed the door in his face, the sharp click of the lock cutting off whatever lie he was trying to spin. I stood there for a moment, my hands shaking slightly, the blood pounding in my ears. I had never confronted him like this before, never stood my ground so openly. Felt strange, powerful, and a little frightening. As I walked back into the living room, my phone lit up again. Another message from my sister, Emily. "Ryan, come on. We need to talk." It's what Grahams would have wanted. I let out a bitter laugh. They had ignored her, forgotten her, and now they had the nerve to invoke her name. I tossed the phone on the couch and let it slide between the cushions and sank back into the chair, the leather creaking beneath me. They were starting to panic. I could feel it. The cracks in their carefully constructed facade were beginning to show, and I wasn't about to offer them a piece of the life they had so eagerly abandoned. They had taken my grandmother for granted, treated me like the outcast of the family, and assumed that I would simply roll over and hand them what they felt entitled to. But they were wrong. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of my phone buzzing against the hardwood floor where it had slipped off the couch overnight. I rubbed my eyes, reached down, and saw the name flashing on the screen. "Mom." I let it ring, then opened the voicemail. "Ryan? Honey," she began, her voice thick with that fake sweetness she always used when she wanted something. "We really need to talk about this. It's not fair to keep us in the dark like this. We're a family. We should deal with this together. Call me back." I tossed the phone onto the coffee table, letting it clatter against an old glass paperweight in the shape of a Swaney gift from my grandmother. One of those small sentimental things she liked to collect. I leaned back into the deep worn leather of the couch and stared at the cracked ceiling where a faint water stain spread like a ghostly bloom. They weren't going to give up. I had known it before the will was read. For years, they had treated me like an outsider, an inconvenience, the family disappointment. But now that the balance of power had shifted, they were scrambling, trying to claw their way back into my good graces. When the doorbell rang that afternoon, I was almost expecting it. I stood slowly, shredding the tension from my shoulders, and made my way to the front door. This time, it was my sisters, Emily and Sarah. They stood side by side on the porch, their perfectly styled hair catching the faint autumn sunlight, their matching coats pulled tight at the waist. For a second, they looked like they had stepped out of one of those old posed family portraits that hung in my parents' hallway. "Hey, Ryan," Emily said, her tone too bright, her smile too wide. "Can we come in?" I leaned against the door frame and crossed my arms. What do you want? They exchanged a quick glance, the kind of silent communication that only siblings who have always been on the same side could manage. Sarah stepped forward and removed her sunglasses with a dramatic flourish. Look, we just want to talk. Clear the air. It's been a rough couple of weeks and we miss you. I felt a flicker of old bitterness rise in my chest, but I kept my expression blank. You miss me. Emily sighed a little too dramatically, her eyes flicking past me to the shadowed hallway. Of course we do. We're family. I almost laughed. The same sisters who used to call me the family failure, who conveniently forgot to invite me to birthdays and holiday parties, who posted Instagram stories from luxury vacations while I struggled to make ends meet in my tiny studio apartment. Right? I said, letting the word hang in the cold air. Family, Sarah shifted, her smile tightening as she realized I wasn't going to make this easy. Can we at least come inside? It's freezing out here. I let the silence linger, watching the slight tremor in Emily's jaw as her forced smile began to slip. No, I said finally. Whatever you have to say, you can say it right here. Emily's eyes narrowed and for a brief second I saw the mask slip, the real her peeking through the calculating Sharpton sister who had always looked down on me, even as a child. Fine, she snapped, crossing her arms over her chest. We just want to know what the plan is. Are you selling the house? What about the savings, the life insurance? I felt a slow, cold satisfaction settle in my chest. There it was, the real reason they had come. Not to clear the air or reconnect, but to find out how much of my grandmother's estate they could still grab. I haven't decided yet, I said, my tone deliberately flat. But I'm sure whatever I do, you'll be the first to know. Sarah opened her mouth to argue, but I stepped back and closed the door, the sound of the latch clicking into place, cutting off whatever desperate plea she was about to make. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood for a moment, letting my pulse steady. They were getting desperate, and it was only going to get worse from here. As I turned to go back into the living room, my phone buzzed again on the coffee table. I looked down and the screen lit up with a new message from my father. We're not giving up on this. Ryan, call us. I stared at the message for a moment, the words sharp and almost threatening, and felt the faintest hint of a smile tug at the corners of my mouth. They thought they could still control me, still push me around like the confused, insecure child I once was. They had no idea how much the game had changed. The morning after my sister's little poor ambush, I awoke to the sharp, rhythmic sound of metal against glass. It took me a moment to realize it was coming from outside, the faint echoes bouncing off the old brick walls of my grandmother's house. I pulled on a sweatshirt, rubbed the sleep from my eyes, and looked out the front window. My father stood on the lawn, tapping a pair of car keys against the side of his Mercedes, his breath misting in the cool fall air. I felt a flash of irritation, the kind that starts in your chest and spreads like wildfire. He had the nerve to show up here again, uninvited, after I made it clear I wanted nothing to do with him. I yanked open the front door and let the chill wash over me. He turned around, the tight, confident smile already plastered on his face. Morning, son, he said, slipping the keys into his pocket. I thought it was time we had a real talk. I crossed my arms and leaned against the door frame. We have nothing to talk about. He took a step closer, his polished shoes crunching against the brittle, frost-covered grass. Come on, Ryan, this is getting childish. You can't just ignore your family forever. I felt my jaw tighten. You had no problem ignoring me when you were drinking overpriced cocktails on the beach while Grandma was dying. His smile faltered for a second, his eyes narrowing. It's not fair, and you know it. We had those tickets booked for months. It's not our fault that her condition took a turn. I almost laughed. The casual dismissal, the way he brushed off his own negligence as if it were a minor inconvenience. Classic, right? I said, my voice flat. Well, she still had someone by her side. That's what matters. He took a deep breath, his chest puffing out like he was about to make some big fatherly speech. Look, I get it. You're upset. But this house, the money, it should be a family decision. We all have a right to it. I felt a slow, icy rage creep into my veins, the kind that sharpens your thoughts and tightens your throat. I forced myself to stay calm, to keep my voice even. She left it to me, I said simply. It was her choice. He opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off, stepping forward and letting the door swing shut behind me. You want to talk about what's fair? Let's talk about all the holidays I wasn't invited to. The birthdays you forgot. The years you treated me like the family embarrassment. He bristled, his jaw clenching. It's not the same, and you know it. No, I said, taking another step forward. My eyes locked with his. It's exactly the same. You only care now because I have something you want. For a moment, I thought he was actually going to hit me. His fists clenched, his face a shade darker, the muscles in his jaw working like he was chewing gravel. But then he let out a long, slow breath, his shoulders slumping slightly. Fine, he said, the force calm back in his voice. If that's the way you want to play this, fine. But remember, Ryan, we're still a family and family sticks together. I watched him turn and walk back to his car, the engine roaring to life as he pulled out of the driveway. The echo of his words hung in the air long after he was gone. The thin, hollow promise of a man who had always put his own interests ahead of his family. As I walked back inside, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Another message from my mom. Ryan, please talk to us. We can't go on like this. You're hurting the family. I tossed the phone aside, clattering it against the ceramic tile, and leaned against the cool countertop, my mind racing. They weren't going to let this go. They pushed harder, their desperation bleeding through the cracks and their polished facades. They wanted a fight. Fine, I'd give them one. The week dragged on, each day marked by more desperate calls and texts. My sisters tried to play nice, sending long, rambling messages about reconnecting and moving forward as a family. My mother shifted to emotional guilt, relying on phrases like, "You're breaking my heart and your grandmother wouldn't want this." But my father took a different approach. His messages became colder, more direct. The polite facade had crumbled, replaced by a sharp, demanding tone that felt more like the man I had grown up with. Then, on Friday morning, I awoke to the sound of my phone buzzing angrily on the nightstand. It was a call from my neighbor, Mrs. Turner, a kind woman in her 70s who had lived next door to my grandmother for decades. I answered, trying to shake off the fog of sleep. Ryan, dear, I didn't want to bother you, but I thought you should know there are people in your grandmother's house. I sat up, the adrenaline hitting me like a shot of cold water. What do you mean? I saw your parents and sisters drive up about an hour ago, she said, her voice thin and shaky. They had bags with them, like they were moving in or something. I felt my jaw clench, my pulse thunder in my ears. They wouldn't. They couldn't. Thank you, Mrs. Turner. I'll take care of it. I managed my voice tight. I threw on a pair of jeans and a jacket, my mind racing as I grabbed my car keys and flew out the door. The drive to my grandmother's house felt like a fever dream, each mile stretching into an eternity. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, my mind wavering between anger and disbelief. When I pulled into the driveway, my father's Mercedes was parked next to my sister's matching SUVs. Trunks still open, bags and boxes spilling onto the gravel. I slammed the car into park and jumped out, barely feeling the cold bite of the autumn air as I charged up the front steps. The door was wide open, the faint strains of classical music wafting from the living room. I stepped inside, my boots echoing on the polished wood floors, and felt a fresh wave of anger as I took in the scene. Emily and Sarah were in the living room, pulling dust covers off the furniture and chatting as if they were settling into a summer rental. My mother was in the kitchen rifling through drawers while my father paced the hallway, a phone pressed to his ear. They all froze when I entered the room. For a brief, satisfying moment, I watched their faces drop, their false smiles crumbling into wide-eyed shock. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. My father hung up the phone and slipped it into his pocket with forced nonchalance. "Ryan," he said, trying to put on a smile. "We were just catching up, making sure the house is in order." I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat. "Settling in? You mean this is my house? You don't get to just move in." Emily stepped forward, her eyes wide and innocent. "Ryan, come on. We're family. We just thought, No. I snapped, cutting her off. You don't get to play that card now. You had years to act like a family, and you blew it. My mother came out of the kitchen, her hands shaking slightly as she wiped them on a dish towel. Ryan, honey, this is all a misunderstanding. We just thought. I don't care what you thought, I said, my voice rising. This is my house, my property. You don't get to walk in here like you own the place. For a moment, the only sound was the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each second stretching into a small eternity. Then my father stepped forward, his jaw set, his eyes dark. We're not leaving, Ryan. This is still our family's home, and we're not going to let you push us out. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold, sharp edge of my anger crystallized into something harder, something unbreakable. I pulled out my phone, my thumb already scrolling through my contacts. Fine, I said, my voice deep and cold. Then I'll let the police handle it. Their eyes widened in unison, the color draining from my mother's face, my sister's mouth hanging open like fish gasping for air. You wouldn't, my father hissed, his face twisting into something ugly. Try me, I said, pressing the call button and lifting the phone to my ear. They stood frozen as I calmly explained the situation to the dispatcher, their shocked whispers and frantic hand gestures doing nothing to slow the steady, satisfied rhythm of my words. By the time I hung up, they had already begun to grab their bags, their polished facades shattered, their voices rising in panicked protest. I leaned against the doorframe and watched them scramble, my heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and dark satisfaction. They had crossed the line, and now they would finally pay the price. The police arrived within 15 minutes, red and blue lights cutting through the gray autumn fog as they pulled into the driveway. I watched from the front steps as two officers got out of their cruiser, their radios crackling softly as they approached the house. My father, who had been pacing the front lawn, froze, his face a mask of barely concealed panic. My sisters clutched their designer handbags like lifelines, their eyes wide as they watched the officers approach. My mother, standing just inside the doorway, had a hand pressed to her mouth, her face pale and drawn. Sir, we got a call about a possible home invasion, the taller of the two officers said, glancing between me and my father. I stepped forward, my heart still racing, but my voice calm. Yes, officers. These people are in my house without permission. I asked them to leave, and they refused. My father let out a sharp, bitter laugh, the sound cutting through the crisp morning air. This is ridiculous, Ryan. We're your family. The officer turned to him, his face impassive. Sir, are you the owner of this property? My father's jaw clenched, his hands balled lead into fists at his sides. No, but the officer cut him off and turned back to me. Do you have proof of ownership, sir? I pulled up my phone, scrolling through my emails until I found the scanned copy of my grandmother's will. I held it up, the officer leaning in to read the highlighted sections that clearly named me as the sole heir to the house, jewelry, and insurance. The second officer walked past me and into the house, gesturing for my mother and sisters to follow him outside. They stumbled out, their voices rising in a chaotic chorus of excuses and pleas. But this is our family home, Emily said, her voice cracking, mascara smeared under her eyes. We grew up here. It's not fair, Sarah added, her hands shaking as she clutched her purse. You can't just kick us out. The officer gave them a cool, professional look. Ma'am, if you're not the property owner and you've been asked to leave, you must comply. Otherwise, we can arrest you for trespassing. My father looked like he was about to explode. His face flushed a deep, angry red, his fists shaking. You can't do this, Ryan. We're your family. You can't just cut us out. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs, my heart finally starting to slow. I met his gaze, my voice calm and clear. Family, you abandoned me years ago. You ignored me, belittled me, treated me like a stranger in my own home. You only care now because you're losing what you thought was yours. The officer nodded, his eyes flicking back to my father. Sir, you need to step back. You and your family need to leave the premises immediately. For a moment, I thought my father might actually lunge at me, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. But then slowly, painfully, he stepped back, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. Emily and Sarah stumbled down the stairs, their heels clicking sharply on the concrete, their carefully curated lives crumbling around them. My mother, her face pale and drawn, took a step toward me, her eyes wet with desperate tears. "Ryan, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't do this. We're your family." I felt a sharp, bitter pain in my chest, but I forced myself to hold her gaze, my voice steady and unyielding. "You should have thought of that before you left me, before you celebrated her death." She flinched as if I had struck her, her tears finally spilling over as she turned and hurried down the stairs, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking. The officers watched in silence as they climbed into their cars, their engines revving as they pulled out of the driveway, the sound of gravel crunching under their tires echoing in the morning silence. I stood there watching the tail lights disappear down the long wind-whining road, the fog swallowing them whole, and felt a strange hollow satisfaction settle in my chest. I had won. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, and the home my grandmother had loved so dearly. But as the adrenaline wore off, I felt the old familiar pain settle back into my bones. The weight of betrayal, the sharp sting of a family that had never truly been mine. I turned and stepped back into the warmth of the house, the door clicking shut behind me, the soft ticking of the grandfather clock filling the empty hall. For the first time in years, I felt truly at home. As I sat in my grandmother's old armchair, the leather creaking softly beneath me, I noticed something I had never really paid attention to before. A small hand-carved box tucked into the corner of her bookshelf. I pulled it down, the wood warm and smooth in my hands, and flipped open the brass latch. Inside, I found a stack of letters neatly tied with a faded blue ribbon. The first one, dated nearly 30 years ago, was addressed to me. "To my dear Ryan, if you're reading this, it means you finally have the home you deserve. Remember, you are always my favorite, even when I pretended otherwise. I just needed them to believe it, too. Love, Grandma." I leaned back, a slow smile spreading across my face as the clock in the hallway ticked softly in the background. She had always known.